Welcome, everyone, to episode 2 of the Argument Clinic. This episode is really going to be great. I'm super excited. I'm one of your co-hosts, Martin.
And I'm the other co-host, Lawrence.
This episode is really going to be good. We're hitting on a topic that we both really think that debaters have a lot of areas to improve upon. But first, just a few procedurals before we get into the meat and potatoes of our podcast. The first is that we've set up an email account, theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. That's theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. And the general idea is, if you want to send us a private message, a private suggestion about ways to improve, if you want to contact us for any reason, related to the podcast, of course, we can answer any questions that you have. And if you have like a more public question, or you want to have a public discussion about the podcast, we have some new social media accounts. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. The Facebook page is The Argument Clinic, and the Twitter is just Argument Clinic because with no the, we ran out of characters for the. We apologize. We'll post our newest episodes there and answer any public questions you might have if you guys want to get into a public discussion about our episodes. You have suggestions for improvements, stuff like that. That's really the place to do it.
Yeah, any feedback that you have would be greatly appreciated. I think it would be helpful to you to hear from us, and it would be helpful for us to hear from you, any suggestions, feedback you might have, suggestions for future episodes, how to correct mistakes that you think you might have found. Any sort of interaction I think would be helpful to both parties. The second procedural that we're going to talk about is the Victory Briefs Institute. They are our sponsors, and they've been gracious enough to fund and support us, as well as give us a platform for publicity. Most of you know that Victory Briefs Institute is one of the nation's largest debate programs and one of the most successful, and they've actually been really nice in giving us a special promo code that you can use specific to this podcast for their camp this summer. The promo code is called Argument Clinic, all caps, and it's $100 off in tuition for any of the Victory Brief sessions this summer, which are hosted at Philadelphia and in Los Angeles for 2 separate sessions. Again, the promo code is Argument Clinic, all caps, no spaces. It is valid for 1 week after the publishing of this episode, so if you want to use this promo code, you should use it now. Thanks again to Victory Briefs for sponsoring our podcast, as well as for providing this promo code for you to use.
Yeah, they're honestly great people. Okay, now to get into the substance of the episode. I'm really excited for this, if you can't tell. This episode is a choreography episode. The last episode was an Art of War episode. These are just some sweet names that we're giving to our various types of podcasts. A choreography episode means we're going to talk about how you actually do stuff in debates. Like, how do you improve at the skills that are necessary when you're in the context of debate rounds, and stuff like that. Choreography outside of this context is just, planning dances and acting on stage and stuff. And the idea is we as debaters and coaches should really make a strong effort to improve and practice the way we debate and not just what we debate about. So that's what choreography episode means. Now, Lawrence, what are we going to talk about today? What is the choreography? What dances are we doing?
So today we're going to talk about evidence comparison. And as Martin mentioned earlier, this is something that he thinks is really important, and we think together it's a subject that is worth discussing in depth and helping all debaters of all skill levels sort of improve their evidence comparison, because it's a really underutilized part of debate that really is a useful skill for all debaters to have.
And we'll go into that right now. We'll just discuss kind of what evidence comparison is and how you do it. Hoo-wee, I am so excited for evidence comparison. You all have no idea. First things first, I think
really
we should talk. Yeah, you really don't. Lawrence is getting aggressive. First things first, we should talk about what evidence comparison means. To me, in my mind, I think it's really easy to confuse evidence comparison and stuff like weighing. Evidence comparison is when you have a piece of evidence, or as we in the business call them, cards, you can compare them to other cards about which of them is more likely to be right. Now, how is this different from weighing, Lawrence? Do you have a sense of why they're different?
Well, in my mind, it's a little different from weighing because weighing is really about impacts, whereas evidence comparison is more about which piece of evidence is more accurate or correct or logical. It's more about who has the right stuff. So I think that weighing and evidence comparison are connected, certainly, but they're not really the exact same thing.
Yeah, so in my mind, it's like you can have evidence comparison really about anything, right? As long as you have evidence, you can say my evidence is more likely to be right than your evidence. It's kind of like broader, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit broader than just sort of the category of weighing.
Yeah, and one thing that it's important to hit on is most of the episode we're going to be talking about kind of like contention level, substantive evidence comparison. But really, evidence comparison, you can do it on anything. You can do it on philosophy as well. Um, Although the evidence comparison would no doubt be different. But I just want to like make clear and tell me if you agree with this, that really you can just do evidence comparison about so many different things.
Yeah, as long as you have two pieces of evidence, you should be able to compare them. So regardless of sort of the type or format of the evidence that you're debating in, being it the, value criterion debate or the contention debate, it's really important to have the skills to do evidence comparison. But you're right, we're mostly going to be talking about evidence comparison that occurs on the contention level debate. So it's going to be more empirical and less philosophical.
Yeah. So why am I so excited about evidence comparison? Well, I actually think that this is why most people lose debate rounds, to be honest. I really think that there most people that lose rounds get told things like from judges like, "Oh, you didn't do enough work on this, quote unquote," or at the end of the day, there was just two pieces of evidence that the judge kind of had to think about and that were presented, and it can be difficult a lot of the time to think about from a judge's perspective, like who's right about that stuff. And I think that a lot of times debaters lose rounds when they fail to do those things, and that it's more than you probably think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't certainly think it's why most people lose their rounds, but I definitely don't think we should underemphasize the importance of evidence comparison. It's really important, and I think especially in closer rounds, where you have to compare these two close pieces of evidence, and judges frequently have decisions that come down to one piece of evidence versus another piece of evidence. I mean, it's probably not as important in blowout rounds where one debater is, the fourth year varsity debater versus a first year novice. I doubt evidence comparison is really that important then. But I think in almost every round other than that, evidence comparison is a skill that is shockingly underutilized or utilized incorrectly.
Yeah, one thing that I think makes debaters less likely to think that evidence comparison is important is that, we have cognitive biases. We have individual biases towards our own evidence. In a lot of cases, we were the ones that found it. We were the ones that put it together. But at the end of the day, it's much more difficult, and I can say this like as a judge, as someone who judges a lot, it's much more difficult to sit down and decide between two pieces of evidence that aren't really explained very well. It can be easy to think like, oh, my evidence is more correct, but that's what your opponent thinks too, and like, who's actually right about that? And hopefully in this episode, we'll give you guys some tools that you can use to get that judge to vote for you eventually. One thing that me and Lawrence were talking about before the show was actually that on this topic in particular, the January-February LD topic about public colleges and universities in the United States ought not restrict any constitutionally protected speech, we think that this topic, evidence comparison, is particularly important. Do you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, so when I've judged a few tournaments on this topic, a lot of times these debates, specifically over the contentious issue of hate speech, really come down to the quality of the evidence that is being presented in this round, because they will have different warrants or, supporting pieces of evidence within the evidence or supporting pieces of arguments, logic, etc., that directly interact and clash with other pieces of evidence. And people are just not very good at comparing those two contrasting pieces of evidence. And it leaves it up to the judge to sort of sort out the story between them. Is it possible for one card to be correct and the other false, or is it possible for both of them to be correct, but there's sort of an alternate reading of the evidence? There's a lot of different ways to compare evidence. And I think, especially on this topic and over that very narrow, specific, contentious issue, people aren't utilizing evidence comparison enough.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I've judged a bunch of rounds on this topic, and there have been a lot of rounds that came down to small differences in quality of evidence about hate speech that were just not explained at all to me by the debaters. And that made them sad when I had to evaluate the round, Made them sad. Well,
yeah, and
made one debater sad.
It might have made both of them sad, who knows?
I guess I don't really know them. I guess some debaters could be sad when they win. It's possible.
But at the very least, you're making one debater sad for virtually no fault other than their own, because they just didn't do evidence comparison. And people, some debaters might be like, well, judges don't care about evidence. Well, I mean, I've talked to a bunch of different judges, and everyone from never judged a debate before to judged over 1,000 debates before, they all care about evidence comparison.
No, that's true. All right, in the next segment, we'll talk about how you would go about comparing evidence. Stay tuned. All right, everyone, we got 5 things to talk about as far as comparing evidence is concerned. And the idea here is we're trying to be as practical as possible. We know that you are going to go into debate rounds, and there's going to be time pressure, and you're going to want to make the best things possible. We're just trying to give you the tools to figure out how you would go about comparing some of that evidence, how any of it would really work. So the first thing that I want to talk about is qualifications. Now, qualifications are pretty important to evidence comparison as kind of like a baseline question. It's how you can think about it. People in LD like to use the term prerequisite. Really, qualifications are a prerequisite. If your author is just a nobody loser person, and you have no reason to think that what they're saying is accurate, what they're saying really doesn't matter. But it's kind of like a prerequisite, because once you reach a certain level of qualifications, it's all just the same. And here's what I mean by that. So I think that there are 3 sort of main types of people, and let me know if you want to talk about any of these in particular, Lawrence. But the 3 types of people are, generally, in order of best to worst. You got professors. These are people at colleges and universities that study stuff and write articles about stuff, and that are pretty smart and got PhDs and all that.
And I'd also add experts in there, so people who work at think tanks or are experts in their field. So, professors and qualified academics, perhaps, is another way to put it.
That's true, yeah. They might not be employed as a professor, but if they are an, quote, academic, end quote, then they certainly qualify if they spend all their time at the Center for American Progress or the Cato Institute or whatever. The second type of people that are pretty good is news article writers. And news article writers, people like Slate and Vox and the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN. Those people, they're obviously less qualified than academics and professors, but they are real people. And when they publish stuff, most of the time that stuff is edited by someone, so it's not going to be full of embarrassing grammatical or spelling errors. Now, a lot of the time, you don't have a particular reason to think that these people really know very much about what it is that they're talking about. But hey, I mean, they're a real human being that has a job, and they might get fired if they publish some stupid stuff. So
yeah,
they have that going for them.
Like their job is to research other things and then publish that in a, hopefully accurate way. And most of these news writers, if they're writing about complex subjects, they usually take the time to interview the professors and academic experts in the field to write accurate articles. So news article writers are sometimes actually pretty qualified to make arguments or to write about certain issues, especially when they interview people who are smarter than them.
Yeah, and another thing about some news article writers, and I was kind of ragging on them earlier, but news article writers, some of them can be experts in things. Like, for example, in the area of technology policy, there are a couple of people that will just, for example, write like all of, CNN's technology policy articles or something like that, right? Then those people I would trust a little more on those issues than maybe someone else. But yeah, definitely Lawrence has said was correct. And the third type of person you can quote is what I've called in my notes a bozo. And these are just people that you have no reason to trust about anything. They are writing on a personal blog or a personal web page or something like that. And you have no reason to trust these people on whatever it is that they say. They're worse than article writers. Anyone can publish anything they want on a blog. Um, by the way, here's the key for bozo articles. If they misspell a word, like a really obvious word, like that probably is not a credible thing. Like if you're reading someone's evidence, after a debate or you looked it up or sometimes even during a debate and you see that they like misspelled the word trillion. I mean like you know, how credible really is that person? Pretty much you shouldn't trust what they say. Trillion's a pretty easy word.
They had to like actively ignore their spell check on Microsoft Word to get that published.
Yeah.
That's not a credible source at all.
Microsoft Word, that's pushing it for some of these people. And I think that part of the point here is just you don't really have much of a reason to trust people like bozos. You should trust news article writers more than you trust bozos, and you should trust professors more than you trust news article writers. But on the whole, you really just want to avoid the bozos as much as possible. Now, one thing that I will say is that philosophy, with regards to qualifications, is pretty much its own deal. Like, philosophers don't really need, like, if a philosopher is publishing on their personal website, it doesn't really matter where they're putting up stuff. Although if they misspell the word like morality, they're probably not not experts in utilitarianism would be my guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there are like two other things that we should kind of talk about. And the
Okay,
first is
okay.
that expertise matters. So professors and academic experts are qualified generally, but their area of expertise definitely matters. If you're quoting a
What do you
PhD,
sorry to interrupt, but what do you mean by area of expertise?
well, what they study and what they're qualified to really talk about.
All right.
So, for example, if you're citing someone who has only a PhD in mathematics, it shouldn't really count for much in a debate about international relations or Russian foreign policy or even hate speech on campus, for instance. That PhD in mathematics qualifies that professor to talk about mathematics, but it doesn't really qualify that professor to talk about anything other than mathematics. Their opinion is just as good as any other high schooler's opinion, really, when it comes to debates about something other than mathematics. And so, merely because your author is a professor or an academic expert doesn't really mean that they're qualified in and of themselves. They have to be qualified in the area that they're writing about.
That's a good point. I see a lot of people just kind of overstating minor differences between professors when they're comparing evidence. Um, One thing though is that I think like within an area of expertise, like if people are writing about political science, like do you think there's like actually like that big of a difference between two different political science profs?
Not really, and this is sort of our second main point, is that a lot of debaters tend to overstate these minor qual differences. I've judged more than one debate where the answer to a piece of evidence is something along the lines of, your professor is a professor in politics from Princeton, but mine is a professor in politics from Harvard, and that is considered somehow to be
Ooh.
an indictment of the quality of the evidence that is being read. And it's like, well,
Word.
that's silly. I mean, I guess there might be a small difference, but it's nothing that's worth stating, and it probably doesn't really translate to anything different in terms of the quality of work that's being produced by these professors. So those minor qual differences aren't really relevant to evidence comparison. It would only become relevant if, for example, your professor was a part-time professor at a community college in politics versus, a professor of politics from Princeton. That difference is probably relevant and worth pointing out. But a difference between a PhD from Harvard and Princeton is generally not worth your time to mention.
Now, Lawrence, you debated on local circuits a lot as a debater. How would you ask for the qualifications of their evidence? Like, would you do it in cross-ex, like, or
Yeah, I mean,
not? Or
generally, especially when it comes down to like empirical questions, I'm just curious where they get their numbers from and if their studies are credible, or if it comes down to like issues of interpretations of the world, like they're kind of another empirical matter, but like descriptions of the way that the economy is working right now, or descriptions of the political climate in other countries, those things I would definitely ask about qualifications for in cross-ex. Just talk about this piece of evidence that your opponent read and just be like, where is this person qualified to write about these sort of in-depth issues? And a lot of the times, my opponent didn't really have a qualified author to back them up, and immediately the perception of the quality of that evidence just dropped, and judges were just like, wow, I don't really believe in this evidence anymore, because they didn't have qualifications to back up this piece of evidence.
so, like, how exactly would you go about asking that question? Would you say something like, um, your career evidence about the importance of United States military power? Who is Tahrir? Is that how you would ask a question, or would you kind of
Yeah,
direct
something
it a
like
little
that.
bit?
Something like that. What makes Tahrir qualified to write about issues of American military power? What qualifications does he have or she have? Just sort of questions like that. I generally didn't try to lead them on. I just would ask them straight up, why is this person at all qualified to make the argument that they are making? Because a lot of times people didn't have a good answer for why that was the case. So I didn't really need to, sneak up on them. I could just ask them up front.
Another thing, by the way, people that I would do is I would make sure to actually have your qualifications on hand for your authors. That way, if someone asks you, you have an easy answer, or at least if you know the answer in cross-ex. Like if someone says, "Oh, who is this McIntyre person?" and you can just say, "Oh, McIntyre is a writer for Slate in the audio-visual equipment department that happened to write this article about hate speech," right? But the point is, like, at least like that's better than nothing, and it's better to be honest about that than just to say my author has no qualifications. Please indict my evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. If you just like don't know where your author is from or the qualifications they have, it just makes you look perceptually weak in cross-examination. Or even during the speech when someone calls you out, hey, this piece of evidence has no qualification. And if you can't defend against that, well, it makes you look a little bit weaker.
Okay, so how would you make a qualification argument? Is this something that you want to discuss later on in the podcast, or would you like to do it now, or we could move
I,
on to the next topic?
I think we should cover some more of the areas in which we can compare evidence before really looking at how to do so.
Okay, that's fair. So let's do the other four things. So the next thing, the second reason that evidence can be better or worse than other evidence, is what I've called recency, as in recent. And this is just completely related to, this is just a number. How recent is your evidence? When was it published?
Yeah.
And
Um,
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
And the real question about recency is just, is recency relevant? So generally, newer arguments are more up to date, they're more accurate, they have more information. So the more recent your article is published, generally the better it is. Uh, but there's instances where we don't necessarily need the most recent evidence. And the real question to ask is, does the area in which your evidence is talking about change really fast? So, for example, if you're citing evidence about our current economic state, recent is good. The more recent, the better. If you have evidence from maybe just 6 months ago, I mean, that's kind of recent, but it's not really indicative of the current economic situation of America. But there are other areas in which recency isn't as relevant. So, for example, our nuclear weapons policy has remained relatively unchanged for a while, and having 6 months old evidence isn't really going to be that bad because it's unlikely that the nuclear weapons policy that the United States has changed significantly in the last 6 months. So it's about the relevance of recency in this instance.
So, Lawrence, I want you to evaluate a card I'm going to make up right now on air. So this card is from Draco Mooneye, and
All right.
yeah, solid name, and the evidence says the economy is doing great. Things I've really been picking up in recent years, especially with the release of the new Model T convertible. Things are just really picking up. And that evidence was written in, let's say, 1923. You think maybe there's like
Yeah,
a little bit of a little bit of an issue? A little bit?
I would definitely think that there's an issue with evidence that is older than probably everyone in the debate room combined in age. It's probably not particularly accurate or descriptive of our current economic situation. Like citing evidence from when the Model T was released is probably not going to tell us anything important about our current economic situation. And even though Martin didn't read a date until after he had finished reading the card, there was an obvious clue about the age of that card, which was the Model T. And you can do similar things in round, pointing out recency differences between evidence, even without a date to go off of, because older evidence will reference older events that are just not relevant to nowadays.
I think one actually pretty good example of this is court cases. And those of you that debated their most recent qualified immunity topic would know that if your opponent had like a pretty old piece of evidence, it would just be referring to court cases that had been overturned and their likely effects. Like that evidence was pretty not good in
Yeah.
context.
I mean, it sounded good because it was like, these court cases prove our affirmative. And it's like,
Whoa.
this card is from 1980. It is not at all recent. It doesn't take into account recent trends in the court. It doesn't take into account maybe the court cases you cite are overturned, as Martin cited, you know. So that old evidence is not particularly good. And that's one thing that we can really press into is the recency of that evidence and challenge its relevance towards the current situation.
And I just want to go back to something that you said earlier, where you could kind of figure out that maybe you would need to know the date of a card based on some context clues. For example, my use of the phrase Model T. So you should look for clues, as you said, in various evidence, and I think that looking for like specific references to court cases can really help, or specific incidents. Like if your opponent doesn't read a date for their evidence, but then they mention something that you just happen to know is like really, really old, you should probably ask them when it was written. Oh, and this actually is a little bit of a tangent, but one thing that you should definitely do. This is actually kind of unrelated to specific modes of evidence comparison that we're going to talk about, but it's something to think about. If you've done your research on a topic, there are some articles that you just know are affirmative articles or negative articles, and your opponent is reading a piece of evidence from them on the opposite side. One thing I really like to do in cross-ex is to ask them to read the name of the article out loud. This happened all the time on the qualified immunity topic in the novice division. When I judged a lot of novice rounds, and I had a bunch of novices, and people just kept reading cards in their neg case from this person Hassel. And
Oh, yeah.
if you had read the Hassel article, that article that the author really does not like qualified immunity. Like they
Yeah,
think
the
they
article
think it should
title
be
was like
reformed.
like they called it living a lie or something like that,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
why
yeah.
qualified immunity was bad.
So at the Apple Valley Novice Tournament, I just told one of my novices to just if someone ever read a Hassel card, to just ask them when you were AF, to just ask them in cross-ex to read the name of their article title, and it was like "Living a Lie: Why the Standard of Qualified Immunity like makes us bad people" or something, and she would be like, "Oh, next question." It was great.
Which is not only good evidence comparison, it's a fantastic ethos moment where you're like, I know your evidence better than you. I'm much more qualified to be the winner of this round. I'm the better debater. I've done more work, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
So it's like
it
a
can
really
be.
strong ethos
Yeah,
moment.
it can be pretty difficult to lose a round in front of a lot of judges after an exchange like that. Although I'm sure people have managed. And like, by the way, one other tangent. Uh, I'll, I'll get into that later. One more thing about recency that I think is pretty important is evidence written before or after a certain context might literally just mean something completely different, which is another reason why recency is important. Here are some examples of that. One sort of as a reason why recency is good, and another one, ironically, a reason why recency is bad. So one reason that recency could be good is, let's say you have a piece of evidence from like the 1960s about hate speech codes in American colleges and universities. One thing that you would know if you've been doing a bunch of research on this topic is that America really didn't have that many speech codes before like the late 70s, early 80s. So that evidence that talks about speech codes in 61 is probably talking about maybe much less restrictive codes or codes that are just a completely different thing, like because speech codes were just way different back then. And that can be a real reason why recency is important. You can say things like, well, their evidence is old, and that matters because evidence prior to that date that it's writing, it's really not even talking about my evidence. It's not talking about the speech restrictions that my evidence is even mentioning. So how do you even compare them? Their evidence is not even about really the topic. And I think that that's kind of an important thing. And then another way that watershed events can change the meaning of what you're saying, this one was actually pretty ironic. Those of you that debated the handguns topic last year, there was a very interesting dynamic on this topic. And let me know, Lawrence, if you also encountered this. So basically, what happened was, in 2008, the Supreme Court declared affirming the resolution unconstitutional. They said specifically handgun bans were not constitutional.
Right.
I forget the name of the case. McDonald versus Chicago was the incorporation case. It was DC versus Heller. Yeah, yeah. So in
Oh
DC
yeah.
versus Heller in 2008, the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Scalia, said, there's a lot of gun control things that you can do, but handgun bans, nope, can't do that. So that had a really weird effect on the literature, which was that articles like academic journal articles written after 2008 weren't about the resolution. Because when they talked about gun control, they were not talking about handgun bans, even explicitly. Because a lot of those articles, they didn't talk about it anymore. Legal articles didn't recommend you could do it because it was so obviously unconstitutional. So you actually had access to a very weird argument on that topic. You could make the argument that evidence after 2008 just wasn't about handgun bans because no author seriously advocated it after it was declared unconstitutional.
Yeah. The main person who wrote the handgun bans articles, their article was published in like 1991,
Yeah, yeah,
and you
yeah.
couldn't find a card more recent than 2008 from this article author because he was just like, well, it's unconstitutional. Why am I proposing this ban now?
Was was that
And I think
was that Sugarman, by the way?
no, I forget what the author name of it was, but
Oh,
it
okay.
it was Dixon 90,
Oh yeah.
a Dixon article. And like there was only one other like article from like John Donahue in like an op-ed section that was like ban handguns in 2013, but there's nothing else because yeah, everyone was like it's unconstitutional. Why waste time writing about a handgun ban?
That
So
that topic was so weird. Just like the F was just obviously like unconstitutional, so just nobody wrote about it, except for just random people in news articles, like people who would write
yeah,
Slate articles that are like that don't know constitutional law would just be like, ban handguns, handguns are bad, right? And it would just be like, well, those are the only articles on the topic because everything else was like from 91. So
yeah.
that can be a reason why recency is actually bad, which is kind of funny, but that's really rare. Usually recency is pretty good.
And you'll notice that it required a lot of topic reading in order to understand why recency was bad on this. But if you can master the topic literature and really understand the intricacies and legal backgrounds behind these topics, you can really do some fantastic evidence comparison that your opponents are probably not expecting or prepared to defend against at all.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Um, One more reason why recency is important is that, and I think this is the really important one. This is the most important one that if this is kind of all you remember about recency, this is what you should remember. Recency can really help explain disagreement between authors. If you have two authors and, they're both kind of decently qualified, they're decently smart people, you have a reason to trust the things that they're saying. Um, Given that, why are these two people, why do they have different opinions on the data, the way that it works, the relevant conclusions that you can draw from it? And one thing is that you can use recency to explain that. Maybe your authors would agree if they were writing about the same time, is kind of what you want to say in a debate round. The basic idea is maybe their author didn't have all the data. Maybe the more recent data is a big help in terms of explaining various phenomena and how they work. So having more recent evidence can be helpful in that regard. And you have two cards that are that could sort of both be right in their respective time periods, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Plus, the authors change their minds occasionally, so having newer evidence also helps take that into account. So maybe one author thought something a while back, new events happened or new data emerged, and they changed their minds about the issue. One example being the handguns topic, where Dixon wrote these fantastic articles for handgun ban, and then DC versus Heller came out and he was like, all right, changing my mind, not advocating this anymore. And so time periods do help explain disagreement in just that sense alone. So we want to conclude this recency section with, again, a plea to not overstate minor differences. So earlier we talked about in the qualification sections that you shouldn't overstate minor qualification differences, like being a professor of philosophy at Princeton versus Harvard. Here, you don't want to overstate minor differences in terms of recency. Unless it's literally down to the minute, your article being a day, month, even a year more recent does not immediately mean anything on its own. So, for example, if you have a piece of evidence from 1 week ago about the state of the economy, and your opponent has a piece of evidence from 2 weeks ago about the state of the economy, and your only response is, mine's is newer, thus it's better, it doesn't really mean anything, because unless something really, really important happened between those two time periods, that 1 week recency doesn't really change the overall economic state of things or the description of the economic state of things. So having more recent evidence by just a little bit of time doesn't do anything for you and is in fact a waste of your time to sort of make these arguments. Overstating these minor differences doesn't really help you in any way, and in fact waste your time because you're being forced to explain why these very, very minor differences matter.
So I'm going to disagree with you in just a very qualified way on something that you said. I think that in the specific case of the economy, having a week's difference in evidence could actually make a difference. But I mean,
it might, yeah. Like obviously if there's a change in events or like, for example, new data like shows something radically different, then it might matter. But if these are like both pieces of evidence comparing like the state of unemployment and the only difference is like 0.001% in like one sector, I seriously probably not relevant, But I definitely agree that sometimes in the state of the economy, recency matters.
But I do agree with you for pretty much everything else. You don't want to overstate minor differences. And you don't want to use recency against things that it really doesn't apply to. So, for example, I was in a debate at a tournament in Chicago a bajillion million years ago, and my opponent made an argument. I introduced a piece of evidence from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and my opponent asked me in cross-ex why it was still relevant, given that Schopenhauer had published whatever he was doing in like the early 1900s. I then asked him if he was serious, and then his timer went off and he didn't clarify. So I'll never know if he was serious, but he really shouldn't have been. It's like you shouldn't be like, aha, my opponent's Immanuel Kant evidence is 250 years old, so you should prefer my staff writer that doesn't know anything about philosophy. It's like don't don't overuse the recency argument there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next major way of talking about evidence comparison is specificity. Now, what is specificity, Lawrence? What do you mean by specificity?
Well, I think specificity really just means how does your evidence directly talk about what you are talking about? Is it the same issue area that you are discussing, like the resolution, or maybe a specific point of disagreement within the resolution? What variables does your evidence take into account, and what does it cover that's related directly to what you're talking about? And of course, generally speaking, more specific evidence is better than less specific evidence because it really talks directly about what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, usually the area of specificity is just like the resolution, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you have evidence that just isn't about the resolution or even related to the resolution in any way, well, then you're probably going to have less specific evidence. It's not going to really do much for you. It's going to make a bunch of arguments that don't directly affirm or negate the resolution. So they're not very good evidence because it's not specific enough.
Now, but this also matters. Like specificity also matters when you're getting into like disputes about, let's say, like whether or not counter speech works. Like whether or
Yeah,
not your evidence is actually like about counter speech is relevant, right?
exactly. So it's not even just the resolution, it's the issue area in which you're talking about. So if your evidence is not about counter speech, but the disagreement is in fact about counter speech, well then you should obviously prefer the evidence that is about counter speech because it is specific to the issue in which we are disagreeing.
Hmm, that's a good point. Um, One way that I wanted to talk about specificity, given that I'm the person who really cares about this, about this evidence comparison stuff, is I really think that the explaining disagreement thing that I explained for recency like also applies here. I mean, I actually think that it's really good for this area. So Lawrence, do you think that it's possible for someone saying hate speech codes don't work, and then it isn't about colleges and universities, and then having someone say hate speech codes work on colleges and universities? Do you think it's possible for those people to like agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there are a few authors on this topic that actually do talk differently about hate speech codes on campus versus outside of the college campus. And so it's possible for those two authors to be in agreement because they're not really talking about the same area of disagreement that they had in the first place. They're really not talking about the same issue.
But to play devil's advocate, the author is saying, quote, hate speech codes don't work, end quote. Wouldn't that also like apply to college campuses, theoretically?
And and yeah, it probably would, but it'd be definitely less specific and would cite less evidence specific to college campuses. And I definitely think that most of us would intuitively and correctly agree that the evidence that's specific to colleges is going to be better suited to address the unique environment of a college campus and examine specifically the evidence surrounding speech codes on college campuses versus more broad claims that are probably sampling things more like society at large or like workplaces or things like that, as opposed to campuses specifically.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And also, like, here's the thing. I mean, when most authors are writing general articles, they don't mean like in every single case of a hate speech code. They just kind of mean like generally, right? I mean, it's just like,
Yeah, just a survey of all the evidence out there tends to indicate that hate speech codes don't work. But maybe there's an exception in one particular area that doesn't disprove the overall
Oh,
trend,
yeah.
but maybe that exception is college campuses. And that's definitely possible, and in fact, is probable with a lot of these authors that talk about hate speech codes.
Yeah, I really like that word you use, exception. I think that a lot of the times, here's the best way to explain the importance of specificity in debate rounds. You want to say, hey, their evidence is a general rule, a general claim about hate speech codes. And my evidence is just the exception to that rule. People can say, hey, most of the time, hate speech codes don't work. But maybe on college campuses they do. And you can imagine both of those authors, once they are sort of talk to each other in a little sort of coffee shop, informal tea situation, that they would kind of agree with each other. They would, clink teacups together after a little bit of chatting.
Yeah, and looking at the specific evidence to that specific area of disagreement that they're having. And new data tends to persuade people in academics who are like, oh, wait, there's specific data to college campuses. I'll change my opinion about hate speech codes on college campuses.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, so the fourth point here that we want to get into um, is significance. Now, here's the thing, and look, we all know this. We're debaters. The tags of our cards, you know, sometimes they don't match what the cards are really about. Or if they do, like not in sort of a very strong way. Um, I know that in my time as a debater, back when I debated the contention, I had some evidence that said some stuff, and what I was saying was not really what it was saying. Like I didn't miscut the evidence, but it was definitely not as significant as the grandiose words I put in the tags.
Yeah, and if some of these examples aren't really sticking out to you, don't worry. We're going to have a later section where we really examine the specifics of how to look at significance or look at specificity or look at compared qualifications, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, significance is definitely not really pointed out enough in debate rounds where people allow people to make arguments that are greater than what their evidence really is saying in the first place. And I know that I did this as a debater occasionally, and I witnessed it a lot as a judge.
Yeah, yeah. As a judge, that definitely comes up a lot. And like, here's the idea: like, you want to explain why two authors are disagreeing about something. I mean, they're smart people. They're both smart people. Why are they disagreeing? And one real reason is that they're not disagreeing, and that their author doesn't actually think that hate speech codes don't work on college campuses. Maybe the card is tagged as hate speech codes don't work on college campuses, but when you're listening to your opponent rattle it off, it just says like, oh, hate speech codes might have a possible negative side effect sometimes, maybe. It's like that author doesn't really think they don't work, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just not really as significant as the debater's playing it up to be.
So what you got to do is you got to prove that your factor, like the warrant, the justification, the reason in your evidence actually is more important than your opponent's evidence. You want to say, hey, this is a real reason that hate speech codes won't work versus their kind of not reason about why they do work. Their author doesn't really think the factor that the author is citing is not significant, maybe, for whether or not hate speech codes actually work or not. And we've encountered a lot of cards with problems in this regard. Like you encounter just tons of cards every like in many debates, especially on the handguns topic. Do you remember that one, dude?
I actually didn't judge that topic very much. I judged maybe one or two tournaments on it, so not very many.
There were just like so many cards that were just like tagged as, oh, like handgun bans will cause something something something, like will cause a huge increase in homicides. And first of all, the card was never about handgun bans because, as I mentioned before, there were no cards about the topic on that topic. Um, and it would normally just be like, oh, there's like a 0.01% increase in crime, instead of like being like, oh,
Yeah.
homicide will go up. And then like you would just have cards from both debaters on sides of this, and you'd have to evaluate who was more right, and you would just read cards, and they would just be like, or like you just be listening to them, and you'd be like, oh my god, like why did none of these statistics match the tag?
Yeah. Like I remember there's this negative card that was read that was something along the lines of if we ban handguns, then the use of long guns or like rifles and shotguns would just increase exponentially.
Yeah, I know that
And
card.
that was
Yeah.
what it was tagged as. And then the warrant was like, we interviewed some prisoners and they said that if there was
In
some
Australia.
handgun bans, yeah, if they would consider switching to long guns. And it was the card was introduced as if we ban handguns, definitively homicides as a result of long gun usage would exponentially increase, and that is just not what the evidence said.
It was just like, yeah, we interviewed some convicts, and we said, hey, would you whip out a shotgun if you didn't have a a pistol? And a bunch of them were like, sure. Like that was
I
the
guess.
basis, and that was the basis for this negative card that was like a handgun ban's bad. It was not good. And then the fifth way of comparing evidence is you wanna argue studies, and we're not gonna spend too much time on this, but Lawrence, what do you have to say about arguing studies? I only did a little bit of that as a debater.
Arguing studies, I think the first thing is just to really know the popular studies on the topic. Like the fact that Martin and I can still reference the popular pieces of evidence or studies on the handguns topic from a year ago. I
Means
think
that
both
we're
said that
degenerate people.
yeah, we don't know anything about life outside of debate, but also just that we do research and we know these studies, so we know how to compare them. But I think even if you aren't super well read into the topic literature, there are a few solid ways to begin by comparing studies, and I'll just list a few of them. I think the first is just by sort of reading author indicts. And this can be something as simple as your author is not writing in an area that they're qualified in, and so using the qualification stuff that we talked about earlier, or it could be more in depth, and by reading pieces of evidence against the specific author for why they are in fact poor representations of their field of study. So for example, there are professors who are professors of economics, but they might be considered by the economics community to be in fact a terrible economist, and they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just off in their own world, and so they're not at all representative of what economics really is. And if you get into college, you'll definitely find professors at whatever college that you go to that you're wondering, how is this person a professor in whatever they're talking about? And those people write studies. So you can definitely find author indicts about these people and why they're bad. I think the second way you can argue studies is sort of to look at the way that the study was conducted. And this doesn't require, an AP statistics class or a college level statistics class to really pull off. It just really requires some basic knowledge of, is the study controlling for the correct variables? Is it taking into account things that should be taken into account in this study? So for example, a study about handguns should definitely have some control variables like handguns should be, or handguns should be a variable. That was poor phrasing. Handguns should be a variable in this study, or they should hold other things constant, like maybe one thing that affects the issue of handgun rate or handgun homicide rates is socioeconomic conditions. Because when people are poorer, they tend to be more likely to commit crimes. And if a study doesn't control for these things, well, it's hard to say if a handgun ban is what directly causes an increase in crime. It might be, in fact, other factors that are at play. And studies that don't control for these very obvious external factors are bad studies.
Really quickly,
And
could you explain what you mean by control for something?
So basic studies or basic statistics is just that there are different variables. There's the control variables, which are things that you have
What's
to.
a variable? Sorry.
Variable is a piece of data that you can either manipulate or keep constant, something that you can change or keep the same. Or there are external factors that might influence a particular study or a particular
So
outcome.
you just want to prevent external factors from creeping into your conclusion, right? It's like, well,
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
it's like, do handgun bans cause crime, or was it like maybe just something else?
Yeah, like, the economy took a turn for the worse. And these are things that studies are supposed to take into account, but not every study does. And being able to point out these simple factors is important. I think the third way to compare studies really quickly is just know better studies that indict the studies that you are reading. So on
Ooh.
the handguns topic, this was really prevalent. There were common negative cards from these two Harvard professors, I think. I can't remember what they were named, but it was like probably the most common negative card, which was just an analysis of handgun bans, supposedly across a bunch of different countries, and it was supposedly a huge, well-controlled study. But as it turns out, the study was terrible, and there's tons and tons of other articles that responded directly to the study and pointed out all the inconsistencies or all the failures to take into account the full data set or the failure to analyze other countries that disproved their initial conclusions, et cetera, and just being able to respond to studies like this. And this was something that I used a lot in Oklahoma. When people would read studies, I would just be like, you do know that your study was conducted by a biased author who got funding from, X organization who is obviously anti whatever cause they are, and didn't take into account like these five important factors that played a result or a role in the eventual result. And I would definitely have pieces of evidence to respond to the most common studies on the topic, and people were just generally not prepared to defend against these.
Oh man, that was so true. When I debated, I had this back when I again back when I debated the contention, mostly my junior year. I I had this one thing. So on this I debated my junior year was I think the best topic I ever debated. The topic was so good. It was about economic sanctions and whether or not they should be used to achieve foreign policy objectives. The word "odd" was in there, but this was when everyone was saying util things. And there was this one study on the topic. It was the most common neg card on the topic, and it was just a piece of evidence that said that economic sanctions worked to decrease the likelihood of oppressive regimes. So it would say economic sanctions actually increase the likelihood of regime change from oppressive governments to non-oppressive governments. This was it was so common. And what I did was I looked in the study itself. I combed through the study and I found that most of the countries that it was talking about were kind of like dictatorships already, or were already prone to be dictatorships. But that um, but that in fact when you applied economic sanctions to like more corner case circumstances, they actually were more likely to end up in a worse government, not a better government. And so what I would do, especially in rounds, so I had a round against my good friend, I would say probably my best debate friend. His name's Brian Wilder. Um, Long out of the activity, but we were debating. We had a round in reference to our last week. It was in front of a starer, and so he wasn't writing down a single word we were saying. And Brian read this study, and in cross examination, I was like, "Did you know that this study actually said?" And then I said the thing that I knew about it, and then Brian was like, "Oh no, I didn't." And then I thought that was like a major deciding factor for the judge at the end of the round. So evidence, arguing studies can be very cool. Now I had no idea whether my table was like actually right, like whether that was actually the right conclusion to draw from the study. But I mean, I argued it. I researched the study, so that was kind of on me.
Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, that is like a fantastic ethos moment right there. You didn't even have to make the argument in a speech. It was just a cross-ex question, like, did you know this? And the judge is like, yep, I think I'll vote on that. And, I think it proves why knowing your evidence and your opponent's evidence and being able to argue these studies is really, really important to all types of judges.
All right, everyone. Now we get to the fun part. We're going to show you kind of directly how to compare evidence directly. And for that purpose, we've arranged a little segment here, which I'm calling the Battle of the Colosseum Battle Arena Clash Arena. Hate
A name
speech.
that I did not agree to.
That name was unilaterally imposed on Lawrence. So deal with it. And the cards presented here are purely fictitious. Any resemblance to cards real or imaginary is pure coincidence. So what we've done is we've just made up some cards. I've made up some cards, and Lawrence has made up some cards, and we're gonna clash, and you can decide, quote unquote, who wins or not. And this is not actually, I'll take that back. It's incredibly real debate. It's very important, very important to me. Okay, so all of these cards are about hate speech, by the way. Um, all right, here's my evidence, and you should try. You should be kind of listening along, and thinking to yourself, and just trying to think out. Hey, what are maybe the deficient parts of this evidence? And then, as Lawrence is saying his, think about that, and then we'll have some Colosseum worthy spats about the evidence quality, etc. So all right, Lawrence, I challenge you to a battle of the Colosseum Battle Arena Clash Arena.
And I reluctantly accept.
Oh, see, I've thrown down the gauntlet, but Lawrence is too much of a stickler for punishment to reject. So, okay, so here's my first piece of evidence. Uh, Quote: hate speech isn't that bad, considering that most of it is just people calling other people nerds. And that's from Joe Blackridge, PhD political science professor from the University of California at Boulder. Do you have any questions to ask me about that evidence?
Yeah, so University of California at Boulder.
That's like a real place. What are you saying?
Oh, okay, that's fair. So so Joe Blackridge is a PhD in political science. What makes him qualified to write at about hate speech and its effects on other people and what it consists of?
Well, I think having a PhD in political science is like pretty good, because political science is where you would be able to talk about the effects of things on our political society. I think that a far better question to ask me is, when was the evidence written?
Oh, that was my second question.
That was
Is
your
when
second
was this
question.
evidence
Likely
written?
story. It was written in 1962.
Oh, that seems really recent, especially since the term nerds, I'm sure, was really popular back in 1962.
Nerds. Anyway,
So,
let's hear your evidence.
yeah, and the reason we're going to have two pieces of evidence compared against each other is pointing out other people's evidence is bad is not enough to win on your own, because if you present equally bad or even worse evidence, probably not going to win. So let's see how well my great piece of evidence stacks up against Joe Blackridge, PhD of political science from the University of California at Boulder. So, the piece of evidence that I have presented is, quote, hate speech literally causes genocide, end quote, from Wendy Burtnote in 2017.
Now, so who is this Wendy Burtnote person? What is old Wendy's profession?
So Wendy Burtnote is writing this on her Blogspot page. She is a professional cactus pruner and is writing about
Ooh.
the effects of hate speech on college campuses.
See, Joe Blackridge is a cactus pruner in his spare time, but at least he has a PhD in political science and is not in unqualified vegetable pruner. Are cactuses vegetables? Are they fruits? Do you have any idea?
I have no clue, but I'm sure someone will tell us in the comments.
I'm sure they will. Um, so yeah, it sounds like your evidence doesn't have any qualifications at all.
But it's newer, and it makes a much more forceful claim about it causing genocide. And because it's newer, it can take into account newer trends that your older evidence can't take into account, because your evidence is from 1962, when hate speech was literally just calling people nerds. But in 2017, it is literally genocide.
Well, to be fair to my evidence, your evidence is literally just the 5 words "hate speech literally causes genocide," which I think when you described your evidence as a claim, that was pretty spot on. um, so
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
mean,
go I'm gonna go with unwarranted, unqualified, and I don't think it really matters how, and this is an argument you all could make in debate rounds. It really if even if an evidence is much newer, if we have no reason to trust what it says, either because in this case it's completely unwarranted, or because it has no qualifications, people that prune cactuses don't write about whether hate speech causes genocide. Um,
The
so
side interest of hers.
so yeah, it's like a very real question. I would say, having evidence that's old, but at least you have a reason to trust what that person is saying, that you could argue that that's better because you have no reason to think that this is even an argument that this other person has made, even if the Joe Blackridge evidence, even if Joe's stuff could be a little bit better.
Yeah. And this shouldn't be a conclusive claim that the Joe Blackridge evidence is better. It probably is in this instance. I think this should be a conclusive
Whoa, are
claim
you
that,
admitting defeat
well,
in the
in
Battle
a
of
broad
Coliseum
sense,
Battle
yes.
Arena, Clash Arena?
Well, I think we should both admit defeat because I think the real lesson to take away is that you just shouldn't cite really old or really unwarranted and really unqualified evidence. It's just better if you have good evidence. But I suppose that if it came down to the two, there's probably a slightly better case to be made for trusting the Joe Blackridge evidence over this Wendy Burt note evidence.
I mean, the Burt note evidence really isn't that great, but I mean, you could still make the argument that the fact that it's from 2017 versus that's literally 45 years. Or wait, no.
Yeah.
Am I miscounting? It might even be more. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
55 years newer. So at least maybe it's about hate speech now. Maybe this Blackridge card isn't about hate speech at all, and maybe this Wendy person who prunes cactuses just sees hate speech on the side of the road all the time in sort of a modern way.
Yeah.
You can
And
envision arguments for it.
right, and it's especially if we have like prior knowledge that informs this evidence. So, for example, if Wendy Burtnote were just literally saying the Nazis caused genocide and that was it, and she was a cactus pruner, well, the evidence is unwarranted, the evidence is unqualified, but it still could be correct because it's describing something that's well known. So maybe in 2016 there was actually a massive influx of hate speech and there's a massive increase in genocide. And maybe Wendy Burtnote is making the correct argument. But because I've chosen such poor qualifications and such poor warranted evidence, it becomes much harder to believe these claims that could potentially be true and more accurate because of its more recent date, which is why picking newer, more qualified, and more warranted evidence is good.
Well, that's true. But also, let's say your piece of evidence like mine, it's like pretty old. The arguments that I made here in this Battle of the Colosseum Battle Arena or something. Those are arguments you could emulate in a debate. Okay, so I'm gonna take one for the scoreboard for me on this one. All right, so now here is my second piece of evidence that I geniusly wrote. Okay, so here it is. Quote, hate speech, whether on the internet, in Britain, or the South China Sea, can galvanize movements for free speech. And that was written by Ralph Ralphington, writer for CNN in December 2016.
So it seems like the obvious problem with this piece of evidence is it doesn't mention the word college campuses anywhere. So the first question I'd ask to Martin here is this card at all relevant to hate speech on college campuses?
I would say yes, only because my author has two Ralphs in their name. So that makes it far more likely that whatever that's saying is relevant to whatever context we're talking about. But the answer that I would give in a real cross-ex is that the evidence says hate speech, whether on the internet, in Britain, or the South China Sea, so it's saying like everywhere possible, could galvanize movements for free speech. And I would obviously say that would like include campuses. But of course, my evidence doesn't say college campuses, and Lawrence is very, very right to point that out.
The other question I'd ask is, who is Ralph Ralphington?
He's a writer for the CNN, as I've written down here in perfect English.
Yeah, and there's questions to be asked. Is a writer for CNN the most qualified to be making such broad claims about hate speech galvanizing movements for free speech without citing other evidence to sort of back up this claim that he's making?
I mean, like, it's not the worst. It's not Cactus Pruner.
Certainly not, but and I definitely prefer Ralph Ralphington over Wendy Burtnote Cactus Pruner. But without citing additional evidence of professors, academics, studies, etc., it's hard to trust Ralph Ruffington just on face without additional support.
One thing that makes it pretty good, though, is that it's from December 2016.
Yes, which is something that I hope you don't bring up when I read my piece of evidence.
Ooh.
So this is a decent piece of evidence. I think it has a few weaknesses in it. So let's see how it stacks up against the piece of evidence that I'm about to read. So begin quote, hate speech on campus severely affects the academic environment and hinders the ability of students to effectively learn about the modern dynamics of the Cold War. End card by John Quay, professor of politics.
Whew, now that is that one is a doozy. Learn about the Cold War, you say?
Yes, the Cold War.
So when did this evidence make its way onto the presses?
1978.
Wow, that is fairly old, and in a very relevant way, because the warrant is about learning about the Cold War, which, for those of you not in the know, is not happening. Sort of hasn't been for the last 20 years or so.
It has
30?
been a while.
30 years? 25?
But in defense of this piece of evidence, it's incredibly specific to hate speech on campus, and it documents the effect it has on the academic learning environment and cites a specific example of how it hinders the students' ability of students to learn by citing a lack of awareness or a lack of learning about the modern dynamics of the Cold War. So it might be a little bit older, but it's way more specific and way more qualified.
But I mean, on the one hand, it's not really an example. All that the card says is that you prevent students from learning about the Cold War. He doesn't say students don't learn stuff and also the Cold War, right? Or am I reading this wrong?
I think it's making two claims. It says it severely affects the academic environment, sort of like as a whole, and it hinders the ability of students to learn about the modern dynamics of the Cold War, which I assume
that's like a little better than I thought.
Yeah, I assume John Quay cares about it because he's teaching about the Cold War, and he's like, oh, this hate speech is disrupting the ability of my students to learn about the subject I'm teaching.
Yeah. Okay. So I think in this one, it's like you have someone who really, like, although it isn't super specific, you could argue that it's specific enough, or with the Lawrence or with the Quay evidence, Lawrence's Quay evidence, it's old, but it's not completely out of date. So I think both of these cards really have things going for them. I'm going to argue that it's better to have a recent but less specific evidence, because if I have evidence that generally applies, and it applies kind of now, whereas there's no reason to think your evidence applies now. And one thing that I would say about your evidence is that, like, the fact that it's talking about the Cold War, even though that's not like a kind of direct impingement on the other parts of the evidence, really should make you, like, pretty suspicious of it, right? I mean, it's just like... Yeah, I mean, that was a while ago.
And if you're defending the Quay evidence, I think one thing you can do is sort of take it a step further and say the warrant or the reasoning behind why hate speech severely affects the academic environment still applies to today, and take other parts of the piece of evidence that I've just cited and take that and apply it to the modern day context and say, well, nothing has really changed about the way students perceive hate speech. It's still really bad, and it still might affect their ability to learn. So if you can cite that, it might help mitigate the problem of it being ridiculously old as a way to push back against the more recent evidence that is from Ralph Ruffington. So that's one way to potentially defend your more qualified, more specific, but older piece of evidence in this instance.
Yeah, I think that unfortunately I'm going to have to concede defeat in the Battle of the Coliseum, Battle Arena, Clash Arena. I think this round in the Battle of the Coliseum, Battle Arena, Clash Arena goes to you.
Yeah, and it's hard to say, though, because both of us have suboptimal evidence. This Ralph Ruffington piece of evidence isn't bad, but neither is it great. Same with the John Quay evidence that I've cited. And even though it's probably a little more likely that the Quay evidence is a bit better on this specific instance, that's not a reason for why you should keep this evidence. you should definitely get better ones.
Yeah, that's true. I'm gonna award the victory to you. So it's 1-1 in the battle of the Coliseum Battle Arena Clash Arena. All right, so let's move on to the next set of extremely good evidence, starting with a nice quote from my little friend Mango Middleton. So here's what Mango has to say. He says, "Hate speech isn't low because, in my experience as a janitor at the University of California, Irvine, I've witnessed no anti-Semitism." And that's again from old Mango Middleton, administrator at University of California, Irvine, January 2017.
So, hearing this evidence, we can tell that it's pretty recent, but there's a few questions that I have about it. The first being, how is he a janitor but also an administrator?
Well, he was a janitor and then worked his way up to an administrator, right? That makes sense.
Oh, okay. So even though this evidence is recent, it's probably not very recent because it's describing his past experiences as a janitor.
That's a good point, but maybe he was just a really hard worker.
That's fair. The second real question is, how is a singular experience as a janitor enough to really generalize about hate speech across all college campuses in the United States?
Well, I mean, that's it.
That's the answer? Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So an excellent defense of why this is a generalization that it is applicable to all public colleges and universities in the United States.
Ooh. Also, my evidence is only about anti-Semitism. Does that help me out?
Probably not.
Ooh.
I couldn't imagine that being helpful for your case, but sure, it's only about anti-Semitism. Also something worth noting.
Well, I've certainly got myself into a pickle here. Let's hope your evidence is real bad.
Ooh, it might be. Who knows? So, I'll be reading this evidence. The tagline is, "Hate speech is incredibly high now." John Smith, professor of literature, writes, quote, "Hate speech runs incredibly rampant on campus now. Not only do surveys indicate that many college students experience it, but when I was personally at the soda fountain, I witnessed several direct instances of racial harassment." End quote.
So, the soda fountain, eh? That's a good old-timey phrase. What you got for me as far as dates concerned?
Well, I have a few dates in mind, but I guess you're asking about the date of publication of this evidence, which is 1968.
Ooh, 1968. That was a pretty long time ago. So, like the last Clash, Clash. What are we saying? Battle of the Coliseum, Battle Arena, Clash Arena. Your evidence is pretty old, but I think my evidence maybe has a different problem this time.
Yeah, and well, not only is my evidence really old, it also isn't very good either. It cites some surveys, but it's really just about witnessing several direct instances of racial harassment, which is really no better than Mango Middleton's experience as a janitor at UC Irvine about anti-Semitism. So even though John Smith is making a slightly better claim, it definitely isn't that much better than good old Mango Middleton.
Old Mango, old trustworthy Mango. You always know Mango to report lack of anti-Semitism at UC Irvine. He's your man for that. But
and here's
one thing.
well,
one thing. Sorry, Lawrence. One thing that I wanted to mention was that I would, even though I really don't like the words surveys indicate, end quote, right, which is pretty weak as far as citing your evidence is concerned. That's kind of better than Mango Middleton just kind of glancing around a building after he had locked it up and checking for anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly John Smith's evidence is a little bit more qualified. The one thing I just sort of want to point out is you'll notice that with all of my past evidence, which has been really old, you'll notice that I never said the date out loud for Martin to hear. He had to ask about it. And you'll notice that in a lot of debates that you have, as a debater, you'll most likely encounter debaters who don't cite the dates of their evidence, whether it's because they're not used to it as a sort of formal format, or because they're trying to hide how old their evidence is from you. So occasionally questioning the date of publication of their evidence is really effective, because both times that Martin asked me about the date of publication on my really old evidence, I had to sheepishly offer up, decades old evidence that has very little relevance to what is going on now.
More like half a century in the case of your evidence. Your evidence is like, whoa, that is some old stuff.
Yeah, I'm like 20 plus now, and I was born in 1990s. So imagining the 1970s evidence,
all right,
can't imagine that being
man.
relevant.
So debate me on this. So my contention is that it's more important for evidence to be recent than it is to be significant, because your evidence was just talking about a completely different kind of hate speech. It was the sort of hate speech that occurred at soda fountains on college campuses, and those don't even exist. And my evidence might not be the most significant, but at least it's about colleges. At least it's in the last half century.
Yeah, well, I mean, sure, your evidence might be a little bit newer, but it cites virtually nothing. It cites a single janitor who witnessed no types of a single type of hate speech in a position in which he is very unlikely to encounter hate speech in the first place, because this is janitor. It's not like you're sort of privy into all of the instances of hate speech occurring on campus. Sure, my evidence is a bit more old, but it's definitely way more significant. It cites surveys. It's about hate speech on campuses. It's about all of them. And it might cite a few outdated examples of the soda fountain, but I still think that you should prefer the broader empirical studies that John Smith is citing over the more recent but incredibly unqualified evidence that you have.
I really think that this one could kind of go either way.
I think both are just like super equally unqualified.
Whoa there. My evidence is my author is so qualified. Don't diss Mango. Mango is my boy.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be fair, mine is also professor of literature, but maybe not qualified was the best word. I mean, just super bad piece of evidence. They're just not good.
All right, I'm gonna say that in the battle of the Coliseum Battle Arena Clash Arena, that this one is a tie, because we only have one more piece of evidence, and this one is the deciding vote. So this evidence is here's my piece of evidence on this last battle of the Coliseum Battle Clash Arena. Hate speech on college campuses has no effect on productivity, on whether or not students show up to my class on time. Thus, I can find no fault with eliminating codes on hate speech. And that is by Frank Chickenby, professor of philosophy at North Southwest Virginia State University.
Ah, what a wonderful state university that is. I'm sure they promoted whoever named it and gave them a medal in their honor.
Well,
North Southwest Virginia State University.
I really wanted to create confusion whether it was a university in West Virginia that happened to be in both the North and the South, or whether it was just in Virginia, but also happened to be north of the Southwest in regular Virginia,
Or maybe the north-southwest portion, so the northmost portion of what is Southwest.
That's a good point.
So there's, I guess, a question to be asked about this evidence, or at least more than one, I would suppose. The first one is, how is a singular professor's experiences with showing up to class on time and his students showing up to his class on time at all enough to make a generalized conclusion about hate speech on college campuses?
Well, maybe Frank teaches a lot of classes.
So he teaches maybe 300 students at North Southwest Virginia State University, and that's sufficient to draw a conclusion to all public colleges and universities?
Now I'm going to say he teaches about 50,000 students every semester. I'm gonna
Oh, wow. What a
I'm gonna
state university that is.
I'm gonna draw the line at 50,000 students.
Okay. Well, even if that's the case, how is that at all close to representative of every other university in America?
Well, at least it's about college campuses.
All right. I guess that's fair. What is the link or the connection between thus I can find no fault with eliminating codes on hate speech? What is sort of the connection between that and the first statement in the evidence?
Well, maybe old Frank is really in it for himself, right? Maybe he just doesn't care about the other professors, and he's just like, well, the only reason that I can think of for having hate speech codes or anything like that, um, is if it causes lack of productivity in showing up to my class. Maybe Frank normally has really high attendance rates, but he's worried about codes doing that, and so if there's no reason to have the codes because they don't affect productivity, might as well axe them.
All right. I'm skeptical about that, but sure. And I guess the final question that I'll ask is sort of how is showing up to class time at all an effective measure of productivity when it doesn't really cite anything about grades or performance or student motivation or dropout rates, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, showing up to class is kind of a prerequisite for being productive in the class. That's what I'll say about
But how does that disprove the effect on productivity, given that there are other elements of productivity other than simply showing up to class?
that. It's true that there might be other things, but if there's not, but if at least enough people are showing up to class, let's say that old Frank is really persuasive, and he knows that as soon as he can get these young guns in the door, he can just persuade him of whatever he wants. But first, he needs to get him in the classroom, and hate speech codes don't really, do anything about that.
All right. So take your best educated guess into whether or not this evidence is good, and let's see whether it stacks up against the piece of evidence that I'm about to cite.
What about
So
what about an uneducated guess? Can I take that?
I'm sure people will take those too.
Ooh.
So we've got a piece of evidence that's like okay, I would suppose, but not particularly great. So let's see how it stacks up against this piece of evidence. So the tagline is hate speech hurts productivity. Review of Manufacturing Rights in 2015. Quote, hate speech impedes the ability of American workers to produce efficiently. There are studies and surveys of workplaces in New York that indicate that environments with hate speech present produce less than environments without hate speech. End quote.
So when was that written, first of all?
2015, so pretty recent, unlike the other evidence that I've been citing.
uh, hmm. What is this stuff about American workers? Is
Well,
this is
it's
this
it's
evidence about colleges?
well, no, but college workers or college age students can be workers, and a lot of students become workers.
So it's mostly about people outside of colleges and universities. So it's less specific.
Well, there's some overlap.
Some overlap, right? Just like there's overlap with Frank Chickenbee's interests and productivity.
Maybe I'd say this is a little bit better. Some at least a good portion of American college students are workers.
But it's really not at all about the resolution. It's really about whether or not hate speech, like I don't know, in like the environment of like Goldman Sachs or something like that, like whether or not that makes those workers produce output better or like manufacture better materials. It's like what materials do you think are manufactured on college campuses other than sturdy intellects?
Well, okay, probably not much, but the warrant still applies at least.
Uh, isn't it just like a survey of New York, like New York workplaces?
Those are empirical studies about the effects of hate speech on productivity generally. I can see why that would apply to the educational realm as well. People produce less efficiently, then they'd probably also be learning less efficiently.
That's a bit of a stretch. Um, Okay, so clearly the clash here is that my evidence isn't as significant in that it doesn't really like the way that it talks about productivity is certainly diminished, and the effect is just about Frank's class attendance, whereas Lawrence's is not about colleges at all, although it is significant. So, um, hmm, I think my evidence is better, but what do you think?
I say we let comments decide.
Ooh, that is that is a good idea. I could just award myself the victory, but I feel like that would take the results out of the capable hands of our listeners.
That is fair.
All right, so in the battle of the Coliseum Battle Clash Arena, what we'll do is we'll set up a poll on the Twitter account once the episode comes out, and we'll have anyone with a Twitter account can come and vote in the poll about who won the Battle of the Coliseum Battle Clash Arena, and we'll announce it on the next episode. So you'll have 2 weeks to go in and figure that all out. Well, everyone, that's the show for this week. We hope that you've learned a little bit about how you would compare cards to each other, and I really hope that you go out and cut some good cards now. That's it's a good thing. What do you think, Lawrence? Do you think it's good to have good things?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about the different types of evidence comparison and compared terrible cards against each other. And while evidence comparison is a really good skill to have, which is why we can tip terrible cards in our favor, I think the better solution is just cut better evidence than your opponent and have better evidence than your opponent. So that way, when you do evidence comparison, it's not quite as muddled or awful as the last four mini debates that we just had.
Hey, those were some quality discussion, and I really love me some bad cards. Um, anyway, to move on to the ending segment of our show, the mini debate. So, all right, Lawrence, I challenge you to a debate on the issue of what is the best fruit.
Didn't we do this last week?
No, that was the best berry. This is a much broader,
Oh no.
the much
Okay.
a much broader and more important topic. Now, I have my answer pre-selected, of course, but I want to hear your case uh, for you for your fruit. Or
Since yours is pre-selected, shouldn't you get to go first?
that's a good point. I'll give you a chance to ruminate. I will select peach.
Okay.
My favorite fruit
Um,
is the peach. The peach is it goes in yogurt. It is very tasty on its own. It goes into desserts. It's really just like a very versatile fruit. It's really really tasty. Yeah. I'm gonna select peach.
okay. Um, I'm gonna go with watermelon. Uh,
Watermelon, strong choice. Strong choice.
uh, it's tasty. It's really like hydrating during the summer. I grew a newfound appreciation for watermelon after a trip to China my freshman year during the summer. And basically, the only thing they eat during the summer is just tons of watermelon because it's cheap and it tastes good and it's really hydrating and refreshing, especially when it's chilled. It's how you avoid the summer heat, especially in areas where air conditioning is more lacking. I also grew to really like watermelon juice, which is they just like mash it up into a juice form, which is fine because watermelon's mostly water anyways. Um, and you drink it, and I really, really like this drink. And it's hard to come by in the United States because most people don't have watermelon juice just sitting around, but it's incredibly good. So that's why I think watermelon is the best fruit.
Well, that was like an actually engaging personal story, and I definitely don't have one involving peaches. So, and I definitely didn't use peaches to keep myself hydrated during the cold China sun, or the hot
Hot
China
China
sun.
sun? Yeah.
Whatever, hot, cold, same difference. Oh, all right. I guess I guess I guess I'll concede round two of the mini debate. That was like actually a pretty compelling point. I can't really argue peaches anymore, but hey, if any of you really think that I bought the farm back there and really that peaches are the best, let me know. Okay, so that's it for this episode. You should look it up. You should look us up on iTunes and Stitcher. That's where the podcast are hosted, as well as SoundCloud. You should leave an iTunes review if you really like the podcast, because that'll push us up to more of the front page. More people will find the podcast. Um, we'd also appreciate it if you just kind of give the podcast to other people that you know. You listen to the podcast and you have other debaters, on your local circuit who you think might also want to listen to the podcast just because it's pretty fun, or you know of the teammates or coaches or just other people that might want to be involved. We'd really appreciate it. Just like word of mouth is the best thing for these sorts of things. So we'd really appreciate it if you did something like that. Email us any questions to theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. You can also, again, find us on Twitter, find us on Facebook, go to our SoundCloud page, leave a comment on the SoundCloud page. Really just anything. Any parting thoughts, Lawrence?
Yeah, so again, word of mouth is really important to us. We want this to be a resource for everyone in the debate community. As we mentioned in the first episode, if you're, not from a big team, or you're a coach just learning how to teach debate, or you just want to learn more about debate, we'd really like this resource to get out to as many people as possible. And finally, we'd once again like to thank Victory Briefs for sponsoring this podcast. And once again, they've provided a promo code for you to use if you want to attend the Victory Briefs Institute that is mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. It's Argument Clinic, all caps, and again, it's worth $100 off any of the sessions at VBI and will be active for a week after this podcast launch. Just check out Victory Briefs or their blog at vbriefly.com and check out what this camp has to offer and see if it might be a good fit for you.
All right, everyone, that's the show for this week. Thanks for tuning in.